I would say welcome from a very sunny Belgium, wherever you're dialing in from. I hope you're also enjoying spring vibes. Good. So, before I get started, I made a small disclaimer here because what I want might be a bit provocative on the perspective of S&OP, might be a bit provocative from the perspective of APS, and both supply chain practitioners as APS vendor may be confused by some of the messaging that I want to bring in this webinar, and the messaging is that as and APS as we know it, I believe it has some serious limitations. And what is the disclaimer? Well, what I will tell today is based on a LinkedIn article I published in November. It's called The Double Grid Lock. I will come back to that. And as the CEO of Solventure, a company that is selling and implementing S&OP and APS, I've seen that people were a bit confused and say, hey, Bram, we just started working with Solventure and one of your APS solutions. And now you are telling me that S&OP and APS are not working. So customers have been confused, our partners have been confused. And so before you get confused, what we want to do is, by pointing out the limitations, what we want to do is create more realistic expectations on what S&OP and APS can bring and cannot bring. And despite the limitations, there's obviously a lot of value we can bring and we can drive with S&OP and APS. So if you are working with us or you are planning to work with us, yes, you still made the right choice. To then really kick it off, I believe that we face an issue, and the issue we face is it's a double problem. So on the one hand, I truly believe that S&OP, as we have learned it, that has some issues. It has serious limitations, and also the APS systems that have been built to support those processes also have serious limitations. And if I observe the market, I believe that we are in a gridlock. My feeling is that vendors are not moving because we as buyers of planning systems keep asking for what I would call outdated planning functionality. And it's much stronger than I initially expected. And to me, it really feels like as S&OP practitioners, we some kind of how have been brainwashed. We have been brainwashed by people like Oliver White. We have been brainwashed by Apex. We have been brainwashed by Thomas Wallace. Where I'm now for myself, it's like, okay, I have been brainwashed as well. Like 10 years ago, I really took the theory of S&OP for the truth. But I can say that I no longer do. And the goal of this webinar again is to share some of those insights and to discuss about some of those insights with you. And to put things in context or perspective. So if we look back on when S&OP, IBP, integrated business planning, hierarchical planning, advanced planning systems, those concepts were invented 30 to 40 ago. One of my first books I read on S&OP is the book here from two gentlemen, Ling and Goddard, working for Oliver White, Improve Control of the Business with Sales and Operations Planning. And that book was first published in 1988. 1988, we are now 2026. which means that is 38 years ago, or more or less 40 years ago. So the initial concepts of S&OP were invented 40 years ago. 40 years ago is about the time that we in the family, I have two older brothers, we had our first personal computer. We were extremely proud. It had an Intel 286 processor with 60 megabytes of RAM. Obviously, it was standalone. There was no internet. There was no connection. The only connection was the floppy disk. First the white floppy disks, and then the smaller floppy disks. It's also about the time that the first mobile phones were invented for every consumer, some very niche applications. And as you can see from the photograph, the first mobile phones were bricks with whom you could kill someone. So S&OP and APS were invented in this era. If I'm critical, which I typically am, if I look at APS systems today are more or less still doing the same as they were doing 40 years ago. They might do it in a different technology stack. So today everybody's moving to the cloud. We all want to have SaaS. Most probably they do it a bit faster and they can deal with bigger data sets. But if you look at the basic capabilities of APS systems, they have remained largely unchanged. And again, so the issue I see is that S&OP and IBP as processes were invented in that area, APS systems were invented in that area, and because we as buyers keep asking for outdated stuff, there's also little incentive on the side of APS builders and vendors to come up with new approaches. If we dig a bit deeper, so what is a typical traditional S&OP approach and what could be alternative approaches? Let me start by demand planning. And if I look at demand planning, and when we get an RFP, request for proposal for demand planning tools or demand planning functionality, what are the questions we typically get? People would typically ask the following. Question one, can your tool generate a statistical forecast? So we're looking for statistical forecasting capabilities. Question two, can sales then enrich that baseline forecast or that statistical forecast? So through the tool, we also want to drive a collaborative forecast with the sales community. Question three, we also want to use the tool for a demand review meeting, and in that review meeting, we want to consensus demand. The consensus demand is typically then the output of our demand review, and with that consensus demand, we will step into the supply planning process. So, first question to you. I want to drive some interaction through Mentimeter. So generating a stat forecast, then looking for a collaborative process with sales, and then coming to a consensus demand. Are you doing this? If you would be looking into S&OP tooling, is this what you ask for? I see a lot of yeses. I see a no here and there. I see partially yes, it's bread and butter, not stat forecast, more naive forecast by sales. So, and again, I believe that's where a stat forecast can help. And so we have intelligent algorithms which, based on history, can extrapolate into the future. If we have it available, we should use it. Let me switch back to my presentation. Based on our demand forecast, go into supply planning. Typical requirements for supply planning, again, looking at RFPs, people would most probably ask us, like, can your true run supply scenarios. And what do we mean with supply scenarios? Let me give an example. So I could say maybe the statistical forecast is 100. The consensus demand is 120. So sales is a bit more optimistic. And a scenario could, for instance, be like, okay, what if we produce the 120? So we put the consensus demand in the supply plan, but we would only sell 100. So we only sell the stat forecast. What's then the excess inventory or the unplanned inventory? Alternative scenario could be, okay, what if we only put the 100 plan? So we will start from the statistical forecast, but we would still sell the 120. So we sell the consensus demand, which could obviously create a sales risk or a service risk. So matching demand scenarios and supply scenarios, that's what we would typically see as typical requirements for supply planning. So my question again to you would be, continuing on our Mentimeter slide, are you doing this? So what if we produce 120 and we only sell 100? What if we produce 100 and we try to sell 120? What is then the impact? Is this stuff that you are recognizing? So these were the typical supply planning requirements. And my question to you was, that's the Menti we are looking at. Are we running these type of scenarios, like what if we produce 120 and we only sell 100, or the other way around, we produce only and then we sell 120, what is happening? So what I notice here is, like, when it's with demand, it's bread and butter, somebody says, so everybody does it. When it's to supply planning, we see that the answers are already a bit more nuanced. So some people say yes, we do it. I see more no's. More people say no, we are not doing that. And there's also more nuanced answers. We do it sometimes. We do make to order. We usually work with the consensus forecast, as we do have longer lead times, which require us to produce the forecast part of our assortment. Yeah. But even if we have longer lead times, we may have different demand scenarios and then try to analyze what could be different production scenarios and how do we combine demand scenarios and production scenarios. Scrolling to, no, there's always discussion on the quantity to be produced. Too many complex combinations of scenarios to do this. So we are already a bit more cautious in saying yes here. The comment I want to make here is that what I just said, matching two demand scenarios with two supply scenarios, that's probably something we can still do with existing APS systems. I want to take the process and the tooling requirements a bit further. So what's the problem? I think there is a problem with our consensus demand process as we have learned it, and I truly believe we should change the approach. Instead of going for a consensus demand, I believe we need to do something different. Why do I believe we need something different? Well, let me describe what I observe in companies. So how does consensus demand work? What I sometimes see happening is the following. I see happening the following. Sales says, we're going to sell 150. That's what sales says. And supply chain says, what? They're never going to sell 150. They're maybe going to sell 100. Why do we say that? Hey, look at the historical sales. Look at the statistical forecast. Right? As always, sales is way too optimistic. We will never get to the 150. And then there is some kind of arm wrestling. That's the consensus demand process. Yeah? And at the end of the consensus demand process, yeah, we then settle for 120. That's how consensus demand works. If I take two steps back, yeah, I understand sales. Somebody says we have long lead times. Well, I understand sales. If I don't put the 150 in the plan, I could be in a situation that I'm never able to produce the 150, so I will never be able to sell the 150. Yeah? And especially if you have longer lead times, yeah, and we are lagging behind on the budget, I see that pressure increasing. Then sales really says like, okay, if we don't put it in the plan, we will never be able to sell it. Yeah, so that's the sales side. I also understand supply chain. Yeah? On the supply chain side, we say, okay, if we put the 150 in the plan, we produce the 150, but we only sell the 100. What is the result? Left in inventory as the target on inventory. It's me supply chain. Yeah, so that arm wrestling of do we put it in the plan, do we not put it in the plan? Yeah, that's what I see happening. And in a certain sense, I understand both perspectives. Again, a question to you here on the Mentimeter. Are you suffering from bias, the forecast? That's basically the struggle we see here, that but sales is always too optimistic. Or when we are doing the budgeting, it could be the inverse. Then sales is sandbagging. Yeah, and yeah, we all have a consensus demand. That's what we discussed. Yeah, so a lot of yeses here. Over forecasting. Somebody says no. Times over optimistic sales team. Yes, usually positive bias. Of course, somebody says. Yes, over forecasting, not systematically. Sometimes no. In general, I would say I have a lot more yeses than I have no's here, or than we have the sometimes. I see a problem with that consensus demand. Yeah? And for me, the problem with consensus demand is that it ignores the fact that different departments have a different attitude towards risk. So again, consensus demand ignores the fact that different departments have a different attitude towards risk. If we start with sales, you know what? Salespeople will always be optimistic or opportunistic, right? If salespeople would not be optimistic or opportunistic, they would most probably not even be good sales people. So it's something that's some kind of how we need to acknowledge. Let me step to supply chain. Supply chain has an incentive to be exactly right, to be realistic. Why do I say that? Well, as supply chain, if I put too much in the plan, I risk to have excess inventory, leftover inventory, slow-moving inventory, and I typically don't want that because as supply chain, I have a target on inventory. As supply chain, if I don't put enough in the plan, if the plan is too low, I risk having a service issue. And again, as supply chain, I don't want that because most probably also have a target on service. So almost by design, where salespeople tend to be optimistic and have an incentive to be optimistic, supply chain people often have an incentive to be exactly right and to be realistic. If I look at finance people often have an incentive to be a bit more conservative. Why is that? In finance, it's much better to underpromise and overdeliver. In finance, it's better to underpromise and overdeliver. Why? If I do it the other way around, if I overpromise and I underdeliver as finance, I could get fired. Yeah? I often say finance typically takes a commitment, right? So if we just play around with numbers, yeah, we should basically expect that different functions, again, will have a different attitude towards risk. And if I look at consensus demand is like not really acknowledging that. My feeling is that consensus demand is trying to ignore that. Bram, maybe we agree, maybe we disagree, but what is then a different approach, or what could be an alternative? Well, I believe alternative is to work with demand layers. And I truly believe that when we do demand planning, we should separate what I call a base demand, and we should separate it from opportunities. If we start with the base, there I really feel that a base demand should be statistically forecasted, always. And that base demand should not be touched. It should not be touched by the sales community. It most probably also should not be touched by demand planner. And that base demand should be statistically forecast. I explicitly say here by a data analytics team. That could be part of the supply chain organization. That could even be part of a different organization. And that statistical forecast, we could run that in an APS system, or we could even build our own custom analytics model, for instance, including some of the external data which we believe is relevant to forecast our base demand. And then apart from the base demand, we should look at opportunities. And we should ask sales, okay, the base demand is covered, no worries. Now tell me, what opportunities do you see? And opportunities could be upward opportunities. It's extra sales. Could also be downward opportunities, like we are really at risk of losing this or that customer. If we want sales to collaborate in that forecasting process, I believe that those opportunities should be managed in the system. Don't expect to go in 2, 3, 4 systems. If we want sales to participate in the process, let's make sure that they need to access only one system. Most probably they are already in that CRM system. So let's collect those opportunities in the CRM system. And opportunities means, okay, on the one hand, we need to understand what's the potential volume. We need to estimate a kind of a probability. If people are a bit too optimistic, we might look if we can help them with assessing or quantifying what the probabilities are. But these are the two types of demand. And yes, in the APS system, that's where we probably can bring the two together. So in the APS system, we might say, okay, there is a base demand of 100. There's an opportunity of 50 with a probability of 40%. So our expected demand would be 120. It's uncertain demand. So it could be 100, could be 150. The expected demand is 120. Let me again switch to the Mentimeter. My next question to you is layered demand. So separating base demand from opportunities, or maybe from promotions, or maybe from growth demand. Do you have it? Would it make sense? And maybe here, feel free to add a comment. So if you say yes, do you say, indeed, we can separate the base demand from the opportunities, or we can separate a base demand from promotions? We don't, but it would make sense. Of course not, would make sense, somebody says. Makes sense to go further. Yes, we do, based on down and upward developments are included in the forecast. So I see more yeses than expected. In a way, business to obtain its own additional category. And so indeed, if you say yes, maybe feel free to add a bit more on what do you have as different demand layers. Similar concept, base scenario, and then layers of opportunities and risk. Don't have it as described, but tender demand wished, yes, would make sense. And so a nuance to put here is like, when we implement APSs, we also do get the question like, how can we then visualize the tenders? And maybe we can take the tender volumes from the CRM, but then we need to add the probabilities in the APS system. So again, no, let's try to design a demand planning process across the different systems we have. If sales needs to go in the CRM system and in the APS system, you know it's not going to happen. Make sure that sales needs to go only in one system. So let's get that from the CRM. That's where my mind is going. So not really. Yes, partly linked to project sales. No. Yes, not touching the stat forecast. Touching not, so touching or not touching is based on the classification, depending on the case, but always under review. All right. So in a certain sense, what I outline here, again, I believe it is something that you can do with existing APS technology. When I come to supply planning, I will suggest an approach to supply planning where I believe APS systems cannot support it. Thank you for all the good interactions here. I will even look with the team if some kind of how we can capture that, summarize it, and also provide it as a follow-up to the people who are following here. Switching back to my presentation. Yeah. So again, my preference is instead of just having a consensus demand, the 120, if I can choose, I want to have the 100 and I want to have the 50, the opportunity. And based on the demand layers, I want to go to supply planning. And if you look at supply planning, for me, supply planning should be all about scenarios. And instead of leaving open, okay, what type of scenario do we want to calculate? We would need to simplify, and that we need to come up with a kind of a standard scenario approach. And if you look at, okay, what could be a standard scenario approach? I personally believe that it's all about, okay, how do we balance sales opportunities with the inventory risk? So the original example, like sales says, if we don't put the 150 in the plan, we will never produce it and I will never be able to sell it. Supply chain view is like, hey, but if we put the 150 in the plan and we only sell 100, we have an inventory risk of 50. So the goal of scenario management should be to bring that to the surface and say, okay, how are we going to balance sales opportunities with inventory risk or cash risk? And I compare it to driving modes in my car. And in my car, I may have a sport mode, I may have a comfort mode, I may have an economy mode. And in supply chain, finance may even bring us to the super saver mode. And also on my mobile phone here, I have a super saver mode. So if my battery is almost out, it will automatically switch out a couple of apps to make sure that we can support the battery and the functioning as long as possible. The growth mode, that could be okay. We go all in. So we will just put in all the opportunities. Well, if we put in all the opportunities, that obviously will be very good for the sales. So we will maximize our sales. But if we simply put in all the opportunities, we might create a significant inventory risk. Comfort mode, what would that be? It could be that we say, okay, we review the opportunity and we're putting in selected opportunities. And for people who are familiar with our supply chain triangle, if we look at the supply chain triangle here, so the growth mode is probably more focused on that service side of the triangle. The comfort mode will most try to balance, okay, service, cost, and inventory. Mode, what would that be? Economy mode would be, okay, we don't want to put in any opportunities. We're only going to put in the base demand. That will be very good from an inventory or a cash flow perspective. But here we might really start taking a sales risk or a service risk. So you see that our focus is more getting into the cash side of the triangle. And sometimes I see that finance is very aggressive on inventory reduction and on cash flow. And finance might even force us to go into that super saver mode. So from time to time, supply chain managers would contact me and they say, Bram, you need to help me. We just got a target from finance. We need to reduce our inventories with 30%. What could be the reason? We did an acquisition last year. That acquisition was debt financed. And so this year we need to repay some of the installments on the loan. We're not here, so the EBITDA is expected. And if the EBITDA is less than expected, then typically finance will try to find the cash from the inventory, from inventory reduction. So then we could be in that super saver mode. And so in a certain sense, tools can have scenario capabilities. Quite often, I see business people confused, like, okay, what type of scenarios do we then need to? And I believe it come up with, okay, these are standard scenarios that we want to run. And I'm making the analogy here with the driving modes of the car. So let me again switch to our Mentimeter and ask you, do you have automated scenarios? And automated here means like, okay, these are typically the 4 scenarios that we run. Are you doing that? And also feel free to comment, like, would you like it? And do you think it makes sense? Partially, I see more no's here. So don't have it, I would like it. So also if you say no, do you think it makes sense? Is that something that we would like to do? Kind of. No, but it makes sense. Scenarios would be good. But why or how automated? I may come back to that question. Why would we do it in an automated way? But very interesting idea. Only ad hoc. No, don't have it. We don't have them. I would rather work with automated demand scenarios and evaluate the supply chain impact. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm saying something different here. I mean, the reason when I'm looking for those automated supply scenarios is that in the end, we will need to make a decision on how much to produce. And so when we separate that base demand from the opportunities, we will need to decide which opportunities to put in the plan and which opportunities not to put in the plan. And typically deciding that upfront, that's one of the decisions I, as a supply planner, will have to do or have to make. So a lot of no's here. So people say, Bram, good idea. We're not doing it today. Let me come back to that consensus demand. When I first shared that idea, I think it was on a conference or even in a workshop. And when I first shared that idea and we said, okay, let's try to see, and we put all of the opportunities in the plan. What could be the impact on the sales and what could be the impact on the inventory risk? And there was a supply chain manager who was almost in sheer panic. And the person told me, said, hey, Bram, but if we do this, if we just run the scenario and we put in all the opportunities, sales is always going to win. So sales opportunities and realizing sales opportunity always, it will all be considered to be more important than the inventory risk. And that interesting thought. So again, so the supply chain person told me, even if we run the scenario with all the opportunities in the plan, sales opportunities will always be more important than inventory risk. So I said to the person, but okay, if sales opportunities are considered more important than inventory risk, then maybe that's what we should do. Yeah? And so where we really start making the difference here is as follows. Going back to the original question, 150 versus, I increasingly say whether to put 150 in the plan or whether to put in the plan is not a sales decision. Whether to put 150 in the plan or 100 in the plan is not a supply chain decision. Whether to put 150 in the plan or 100 in the plan is not a finance decision. Whether to put 150 in the plan or 100 in the plan is a business decision. And I also believe this decision should be a result of the S&OP process. So we should not start with a consensus at the beginning of the process. We should not try to force a consensus demand at the start of the process. No, at the start, we need to understand, okay, what is certain and where are the opportunities. We should capture the opportunities and the base demand, run that through different scenarios, and then come to a consensus at the end of the process, at the end of the S&OP process. And I think that's really a game changer. And if we try to make it easy, so why do we need automated tools? Well, if I look at plans today, it makes me think of the original Ford Model T. So in the LinkedIn article, I referred to that Ford Model T. And left, you see the brakes and the stick of the old Ford Model T. And to drive that old Ford Model T, you had to be a mechanic, right? You had to know how to start the car. Most probably the car could easily break down, so you also had to be a mechanic to know how to repair the car, to make sure that the car kept running. And I truly believe that if we change approach to demand, but also if with more intuitive management, and it's more going towards that self-driving vehicles that we're exposed to today. Cars are also very complex systems, but if you step into a modern car today, you don't need to be a mechanic to drive that car. And so if we want executive teams to really leverage supply chain planning to drive the business, I truly believe that we need to make supply chain planning easier and easier to understand. And I truly believe that that is where the scenario management can help. And a second reason, if I can choose, I would like to have standard scenarios, is to come up, and in the end, it's about saying, okay, if we put more opportunities in the plan, what is the impact on the sales? What's the inventory risk? If we put less opportunities in the plan, again, what's then the sales risk? And I know it's going to be better from an inventory or a cash flow perspective. And we should start using that as different ways to drive the business. And in some regions where we really want to grow, we might be more aggressive and more go in that sport mode. So I don't know, maybe if the US is an important growth market for me, in the US, maybe I want to say, well, I'm happy to take some extra inventory risk. So in the US, let's really push the gas. It's full speed ahead. In Europe, maybe the market is more commoditized. I want to be a bit more cautious. Also, I'm under more pressure, so I want to better manage for cash flow. And then maybe in the European market, I want conservative. Having mode in the US versus might even be dependent on the economic situation. And by making that supply planning a bit more intuitive, I would really hope that it also becomes easier for the executive team to really leverage supply planning and S&OP as an easier way to steer the business. But then we will need better supply scenario management. So if this is some of the stuff that we want to do, how would it change? I think I tried to discuss more a bit now from an S&OP process perspective, but how would it change also tools? Well, first of all, Yeah, when we want to run scenarios and we want the executive team to leverage S&OP to make business decisions, first of all, yeah, the supply chain planning will need to be financially native. So I'm really sorry, but we will stop doing volume-based planning. Every planning decision we make, we need to be able to show the financial impact. So it basically means that supply chain planning needs to come financially native. That's an important consequence. Yeah. And APS tools potentially can do some of that. It's potentially more in our head as supply chain people that we need to be more courageous to ask for that financial data. But for sure, that is something that we need. So consent around one set of numbers. Here again, we need to be more nuanced. So for sure, not consensus at the start of the process, only consensus at the end of the process. Yeah? And if at the end of the process, so instead of 100 and 150, if we then say, okay, across opportunities, maybe we put 120 in the plan or we put 125 in the plan. If we want to get finance on board and if we want finance to leverage S&OP as a process, we always need to make sure, like, even if we put 120 in the plan, maybe finance only wants to commit to 110. Right? So if we put 120 in the plan, remember that finance in the end makes a commitment. So at the end of the process, finance always needs to be able to say, okay, this is what we put in the supply plan, but this is what we will financially commit to. Is it possible? Yeah, I mean, but we will need to think through how we use APS tools to then, again, potentially do that in a more automated way. Yeah? And I'm going to detail here, but if you've read my not only about financial impact, we also need to understand what is our impact on the environmental ceiling, like CO2 impact of different scenarios. We also need to understand the impact on our social foundation, like, okay, what is overtime that we are pushing towards our people. So there's at least some extra rules here. And I think there's another Mentimeter here for you. Just one question to verify: should planning engines be natively financial? Again, feel free to say yes or no. Feel free to give a comment. So if you say yes, it should be natively financial. Try to say why. If you say no, it should not be natively financial, then also try to explain why. But I'm just here to it where at least we think we should go. So yes, for sure. It would be good to have opportunity to finalize the cost in the supply plan. I don't believe in using all kinds of financial components into the supply solver itself. I would agree. Yeah? So it's not because we can visualize margin impacts that we should start running solvers on optimizing costs. That's a different step. No, but should be able to give the numbers. Yes, but modeling is not so easy. Transport and warehousing costs, etc. This is an interesting one because I often get pushback and people would say to me, hey, Bram, but this is complicated. And I say, okay, even if it's complicated, that doesn't justify creating a parallel universe where finance is doing the margin modeling in their FP&A solution, because what we are then doing is duplicate it, and then we are trying to align the financial plan and the supply, tripling the effort. So the fact that it's complex, but the fact that it's complex is not an excuse not to integrate financial data into S&OP and supply tools. The context can be converted to financial visibility using digital descents. Planning should stay quant. So if we plan in volume with that, but I don't want to get to a different tool to financial impact. As my planner, I should immediately see the impact of the decisions I'm making, and I should be able to see that financial impact. My view. Last topic to share here is I think the biggest change for APS tools or supply planning tools is in that scenario management. Like what I see happening today is that we say, and some companies would say, we have a base demand, we have our opportunities, and what we can do is we take the opportunities with 90% probability, and these opportunities we will also put in the supply plan. If in my IPS system, I would then calculate what is like the result. Typically, I would assume that all of the opportunities with 90% probability will also materialize. It's not the case. If I put my 90% probability opportunities in my supply plan, if I want to assess what will happen with my inventory, what will happen with my sales, I would need to be able to run different demand simulations and say, okay, if I have 100 scenarios, if I have 100 opportunities and each of them have a 90% probability of occur, I know that out of the 100, 9 materialize and 10 will not materialize. So if I really want to understand inventory risks versus sales opportunities, I need a more stochastic or Monte Carlo type of approach. And I try to explain this to leading APS vendors. It's like I did not yet really manage to explain them that with the current scenario capabilities, really assessing, okay, if I put in a couple of opportunities, what could be the impact on sales and what could be the impact on inventory? I believe that with the current APS systems, we're not able to properly quantify that. So we will really need to come up with a different approach here in APS systems if we want to more natively support the scenario capabilities that I introduced earlier. I think APS systems could do a better job, like a modern GPS system, to tell me, okay, you were on your way to a certain destination, but we see a couple of hurdles along the way. These are alternative routes, and these are, call it, extra costs if you go left or if you go right. And tell me, what is your primary objective? Is your primary objective, I still want to arrive on time? Or is your primary objective to be as cost and fuel efficient as possible? Better supporting thinking from a business perspective. I think that is where systems have the opportunity to make big steps. And my final question, I hope you're not too shocked, but do you agree it's time for a new approach to planning? Do you believe in this vision? Is this something that you would like to do? Or no? Yes, this is the Holy Grail. Well, if this is the Holy Grail, let's build it. Let's find out together how we rethink some of the processes we always assume to be right, like the consensus demand. Is that really the right process? And again, it's something simple, but maybe instead of having a consensus at the beginning, we really need to have a consensus at the end. And instead of burying the discussion of 100, 150 in the consensus demand, it's better to run it through the supply engine. And are we even capable to? We are not capable. We can only. But do we then want to do the 120, right? And come to at the end, where we want to go. Are tools available on the market supporting this concept already? Well, I believe with existing APS systems, you can really get a long way, and I would certainly be most happy to continue that discussion with you individually. Typically at the end of the webinar, you can drop a question and we're happy to follow up with you. Requires a good level of maturity in the current process and good tools to support it. 100% agree. Yeah. So if we want to do this, we will need to mature and we really need to have. This is something we cannot do with. But at the same time, it's also helping again the executive team to leverage S&OP to truly drive the business and truly make business decisions. Yeah. And with all the volatility around us again today, yeah, there should be an easy payoff. Again, investing in this type of capabilities, the payback should be much shorter than investing in a new ERP system or an ERP migration. So time to get a crystal ball. Yeah. So I see a lot of support, at least for the idea. So the computer powering is there, the roles, process, and people's maturity not yet. I agree. Yeah, so there's so when I introduced that idea also of like, okay, we have a certain supply scenario and then we have different demand simulations to see a bit what is the sales opportunity versus the inventory risk. People told me it's technically not scalable. Well, if I look at the next 3 years, I don't think there are problems which from a technical perspective are not scalable. Their use are being done in computing power. We are even talking about quantum computers. And so again, instead of being stuck in the past, we really should think forward and think through where supply planning could be going also from a technical perspective. And the main challenge I support, I believe, is indeed with the processes, change the process. Yeah, how do we educate people that there is a different approach compared to the traditional S&OP? And are new ones talking about new perspectives? I would say, unfortunately, no. So I'm also just sharing recent insights that over the last 2 years, but a lot of the planning literature is stuck in the old thinking, which in the meantime is 30 years old. I truly, really a lack of ideas on how planning could be done in a different way. Again, that's what we try to bring to you through this webinar. But if you would find references of this type of thinking, me on LinkedIn, be most happy to share some of those with you. We will close the webinar here. I really want to thank you for your massive attendance and your very good interaction. So thank you, and I hope to be in touch with you soon.